Thank you for joining us on another episode of Latter-Gay Stories podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Ashworth, and you're at the intersection of sexuality and reality. Grateful that you have a few minutes to join us on this episode because it really is fascinating and I have looked forward to it for a while. You'll find out why. If you are watching on a video version of this podcast episode, we invite you to share your comments below. There are a few simple and easy ways to help us spread the video versions. Now, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube and make a comment there. Or if you're here on Facebook, we invite you to comment, and that comment will allow us and allow your friends and other people who follow your page to see that you're interested in content like this. Now, the great benefit to the video version is not only do you get to see our guests, but we can have a community conversation about the topics that we discuss. If you are following along on the audio version through one of our podcast players like Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or one of the others, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you're able to catch our content as soon as it comes out. And we are grateful for those who have chosen to follow us both on the video and audio versions. We are online at lattergaystories.org, so you can catch the podcast version, the video version, and even the written stories right there on the website. Often people will ask us how can they best help the Latter-Gay Stories podcast. There are a couple simple, easy ways of doing that. Financial donations are always appreciated. Running a podcast like this is never inexpensive or free, so we always welcome your donations. There are a couple ways of doing that. By logging onto our website at lattergaystories.org and clicking on the Donate tab, you'll have an opportunity to make a financial donation. A $5 donation or even a monthly donation supports the podcast all the same, and we're appreciative of those donations. We're also Venmo friendly. If you want to send us a Venmo donation at Latter-Gay Stories, we'd be happy to accept that there as well. Another simple way of helping the Latter-Gay Stories podcast is just by sharing content just like this. If you find this podcast episode fascinating, intriguing, a couple nuggets of truth and inspiration, we invite you to click the like or love button or even share it or comment below, and that will help our reach immensely. People just don't realize how a simple share or a comment on an episode like this helps us to attract thousands of additional views and people who become engaged in this topic. And that's exactly what we're interested in. We are interested in building bigger and stronger bridges between the LDS and LGBTQ communities. And it's through podcast episodes like this that we're able to do that. So thank you for your support. Now, today's episode, super excited. I've been looking forward to this podcast episode because of the interesting trail that gets us to this topic. Now, today's guest not only has experience in Mormonism and also falling along the LGBTQ spectrum, but he left Mormonism to join a polygamist church and then came out or through a series of events. He gets married, comes out to his wife, so it's a story of mixed orientation marriage, mixed with traditional Mormonism, mixed with polygamy, mixed with the trail towards authenticity and honesty. So it's a really fascinating episode. So without much ado, I want to welcome to the podcast, Bernie Jessop.
Thanks, Kyle.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So that was a 30,000 foot view of your story. What did I miss?
5 kids.
Yeah. 5 kids, coming out, divorce,
Yeah.
lawyers, polygamy, paychecks, and
Yeah,
so we've got a lot to talk about.
a lot, yeah.
Thank you for joining us and
Thank
giving
you.
us a little bit of
Thanks
your time.
for having me.
Really excited about that. So, you, just kind of like in the intro, this will be a podcast episode that I think will be fascinating to the mainstream Mormon listener because there is this fascination with polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of the LDS Church's history. So I think we should probably walk down that aisle a little bit and discuss exactly what the world is like, because you have experience on both sides of that aisle, both
Mm-hmm.
Mormonism and polygamy, a polygamous offshoot of the church or a polygamous church that exists, obviously. So you have experience on that. You also identify as gay. So there's that story that you can intertwine between both communities as well. But maybe before we get into your story, let's, I think for the listener's sake, describe a little bit about the groups. The traditional, and maybe this will help our listeners as we go through. I will at fault continue to call the church the church.
Yeah.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the church, because that's just the familiar vernacular in my world. But you left the church, the mainstream LDS church, and joined the AUB, which is in terms of original church history, whether you're FLDS, part of the AUB, or an independent group, it's all Mormonism, because that originally was where it all originated from. So you joined the AUB. Maybe talk a little bit about who and what the AUB is for our listeners' benefit, and maybe even independence as well, just to kind of give our viewers and listeners a little bit of a better understanding of how this will all work.
Originally, all polygamous groups were one group, and they all have the same origins. They all point to John Taylor, and in 1886, they believe John Taylor had Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith appear to him and commission him to ensure that polygamy would remain on the earth until Christ's second coming. And all the way up until the 1950s, there was only one polygamous group. And in the 1950s, there was a split. And it was a three-way split originally, but through time, there have been various factions that have split off from other people, or other groups have formed from that original three-way split. The main group remained in Colorado City and is the FLDS church today that is most commonly in the news. The AUB was formed by Rulon Allred, and that's the group that my family actually ended up joining. And then there are a group of people that are called independents because they chose to join neither of them. They felt like both of them were wrong. But they also felt like they were not entitled to organize. And they actually will cite sometimes that that's part of the folly of these other polygamous groups, is that they're organized, and that Joseph Smith commissioned them not to organize into a formal church, because all of them at the time believed that the church was the only church. And so to organize into another church was trying to redo the work of Joseph Smith, which was already done. And those are the people that are independent of all other groups because they don't belong to any group.
And most people don't realize the symbiotic relationship between the AUB, the FLDS, and the LDS Church, and maybe more so with the AUB and the LDS Church, because there's not that dress code, there's not the different mannerisms, the oddities, you would say, in non-traditional Mormonism that you see, like the FLDS group or Warren Jeff's group, Southern Utah groups, prairie dresses, just the different intricacies of that part of the religion. But the AUB and the LDS Church are very similar. Members of the AUB attend LDS Seminary, Institute, church schools. The doctrine is very similar to the point where you get to like the John Taylor time, where you just talked about that split. Third prophet of the LDS Church, also the LDS Church's tumultuous history with polygamy at that point.
Yeah.
So, and maybe let's just briefly talk about the separation between the church and the priesthood, and that might also help our listeners understand how the LDS Church differs from the AUB.
Sure. The AUB has a very affectionate way of looking at the church. They view the church as the mother, and they view the priesthood as the father. And they view that their view right now is that the mother and the father are separate, and that there will come a time when Joseph Smith will return and reunite them. And so there's a certain reverence that the AUB holds toward the church. In fact, a lot of times when the church is holding conference in April and October, they will not go to church and watch church conference instead. So there's still a loose tie to the church and a certain amount of revere that is held toward the church. There is, however, a slight looking down on someone from the AUB who goes to the church. And maybe we can touch more on that later. But it's almost as though they feel like they couldn't hack it. So
we're talking about celestial kingdom Mormonism.
Maybe terrestrial.
Terrestrial, yeah. Even worse.
Yeah. So, terrestrial is the middle one.
That's right. Yeah. Now I had to go back to my Mormon history.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, which one was that?
Yeah.
Sun, moon, or stars?
Yeah, the moon.
So, your story, because this is a fascinating journey of how this is all going to unfold. At what point did you realize I'm different?
I'm different. I realized at a very young age, because I was more effeminate as a little boy, and would play with my sisters, play dolls. I was often called a sissy when I was a little boy at school. Often had girl playmates at school, and so I knew that I was different, but I didn't know what it was. I think. I had my first crush on a boy when I was 7, but I didn't know that it was gay. I just knew that I liked this boy. I think the very, very first time that I referred to myself in my own mind as gay, I was already in college. So it was much later in life that in my own mind I started to call myself gay. I think up until then, it was just so verboten that I was even afraid to admit it to myself. And the same order of sins that the church regards homosexuality exists in fundamentalism, where the worst sin is the sin against the Holy Ghost, and the next sin after that is murder, and then sexual sins are next. And homosexuality ranks high among the sexual sins. And I believe it's the same in the church, because I grew up with the same mentality in the church.
So you knew as a Mormon, you as a Latter-day Saint, you were different, you were gay. Mm-hmm. In college is when you really cemented that, which was after your family had then left Mormonism, mm-hmm. And joined fundamentalist group, the AUB. The interesting part here that I also wanted to kind of touch on was the similarities between that policy, because your family was now excommunicated from the traditional LDS Church. The church excommunicated them in a policy that really mirrored the November 2015 policy that excommunicated gay people in the church. The language is almost verbatim. If you join the polygamous group, or if you are in a same-sex relationship, you are excommunicated as an apostate. Your children are not able to join the church mm-hmm. until they turn 18. Yeah. Disavow the belief or teaching, whether it's polygamy or the same-sex marriage. Appeal to the first presidency for approval for baptism. And then, and under all those conditions, can they join? So your family went through that excommunication process, really similar to the way a homosexual family or a family in a same-sex relationship in modern Mormonism and in the traditional church would have went through. Yeah. How did that play out in your mind, or the experience of your family as you saw that experience happen? You were now, in effect, disenfranchised from the faith of your family. Yeah. The genealogy was Mormon, and now you're cut off from it.
Yeah, and it was there was a certain amount of being cut off that was palpable. My mom's family was very much mainstream LDS. So was my dad's, but my dad didn't have as large a family as my mom did. My mom had several brothers and sisters. My dad just had one sister, and one of my uncles on my mom's side was also a general authority. He wasn't at the time we were excommunicated, but there was a lot of shunning that took place with my mom's family, especially towards her and my dad. I think the aunts and uncles were probably a little nicer to us nieces and nephews, because I think there was still hope that we would come back to the church. But there was a definite shunning where they just stopped one of my aunts just stopped all communication with my mom for years. It hasn't been until the last couple of years that aunt has started reaching out to my mom again. And so almost a lifetime of no contact because of my mom's choice to follow my dad. There was, when our family was excommunicated, it was announced over the pulpit. We weren't there because I had already come to Utah for college, but my family had stopped going to church as well. But the bishop got up on the pulpit, announced our excommunication, told both wards in our hometown not to associate with us at all. And so there was, whenever I would go back to visit, there was a very definite shunning that was taking place. And it also happened when I was here in college. I was going to school at the time when everyone my age was going on a mission, and people started asking me, why aren't you going on a mission? And I was very frank and honest with them and would tell them my family was excommunicated last year for heresy. And then they wouldn't want to be friends with me anymore. It was kind of interesting how that would happen. Some of them would be humane, but there was a lot of people that stopped being my friend when they found out why I was excommunicated. And a very similar thing exists in the AUB when I came out, and I experienced something very similar, and I think that it's probably the same thing that gays in the Mormon Church have experienced with that edict in 2015. There's probably a certain amount of shunning that took place and a little more ostracism than would be normally felt, I think.
All right, before we get to your coming out story, let's talk about, so you leave the church, the LDS Church, you're now introduced and baptized into the AUB. You know you're different. Mm-hmm. You know you're entering into a church that promotes polygamy.
Yeah.
Like the taking of multiple wives. And you know, I'm probably interested in taking multiple husbands. How do we get to this point? Like, how does a polygamist who's gay become a polygamist?
It's mostly because of the way we're raised and indoctrinated from a very young age, right? And we're taught that nothing short of that highest degree of the celestial kingdom is acceptable. Even though somehow we all know that something less than that is acceptable, there's just nothing less than perfection is tolerable. And I think as Mormons, we're even within the church, whether it's Mormons in the church or Mormons who are fundamentalists, we are raised to be such perfectionists with our eternal goal that anything less than that is unacceptable. And I think it's because of the way we're raised like that, that to know that this part of me would prevent me from achieving that perfection means that it needs to be smothered. I just can't acknowledge that part of me. And a lot of times that's what I was doing. I was really trying hard at that time to smother that part of me. In fact, when I moved from Utah to Arizona when I was still in college, I moved from transferred from the U to ASU. Going to ASU was very hard for me because guys would walk around campus shirtless. And because it was such a distraction for me, I would walk with my head facing down. And my memories of walking to class at ASU, all I can remember is just a sidewalk. I don't remember looking up because I couldn't look up. I would be too distracted by the guys. And I think that all of us, whether we're in the church or fundamentalist Mormons, I think we all have a very similar struggle going on inside about knowing what we feel internally is in direct opposition to what our eternal goal is. And I think that that's why I was able to lay it aside and pursue the conversion that my family was pursuing with fundamentalist Mormons, because in fundamentalist Mormonism, that highest degree of the celestial kingdom can't be reached unless you live polygamy. And so that same eternal pressure that you feel in the church to make it to the celestial kingdom exists in fundamentalist Mormonism, but now there's an added layer where not only do you have to live all of the rest of this part of the religion, but you also have to live this part too, which is plural marriage or polygamy.
And that's a hard thing to reconcile, knowing that, and maybe this is just my perception of this topic, but knowing that that's not authentic, that's not honest, that's not me. Like I'm just not attracted to the idea of spending eternity with a woman. Mm-hmm. My DNA, my makeup, my everything that I am tells me that's not a congruent fit.
Yeah.
So much pressure.
Yeah.
I can completely understand that, going through college, trying to kind of walk that minefield and make sure you don't mess up or hit a landmine or fall further into that. But how do you deal with that being entrenched in the church now? I mean, you're attending that. You are at this point an active member of that church.
I think the bigger part was I was smothering it, and so it didn't really surface again until after I was married and had been married for a while. My now ex-wife, I met her when I was 19, so I had been a very recent convert to the AUB. She was the first woman that I felt anything at all towards. I had never felt any sort of attraction or even a desire to get to know a girl or a woman before then. I just didn't date. That desire wasn't there. And usually when a girl would express interest in me when I was a teen or even in my college years, it was met with rejection on my part. Like it would gross me out if somebody would express interest in me. Like if they were my friend and they were like, had their girlfriend tell me that they liked me, then it was always a total turnoff for me. But with my ex-wife, when she told my sister that she liked me, it was the first time where not only was it not a turnoff, but my curiosity was piqued. And as we got to know each other, I started to feel something, and I just assumed that was it. That was love, and what I was feeling for her was love, and that I was falling in love. I now know, my ex-wife used to accuse me during our marriage that I wasn't in love with her. And she would tell me that a lot. She was like, "You're not in love with me." And I would get upset with her. And I would be like, "Don't say that. Of course I'm in love with you." But hindsight, after leaving the marriage and having since been in love before, she was right. She could sense it. She knew that I wasn't in love with her. But I didn't know any different. I had never been in love before. I had never felt anything for anyone. And so just feeling something for her, I took it as a sign that was who I needed to marry and who I should be with. And so I pursued marriage with her. And for years, we were so ingrained or engrossed rather in raising children, because we had all of our children in really short succession. And I was working 2 jobs all the time. And so I just really didn't have a lot of time to devote to that part of me until it started to well up even more.
So let's talk about that, because the discussion of a mixed orientation marriage isn't one that we have an opportunity to feature a lot on the podcast. Mostly it's just individual stories of being gay or lesbian. She knew ahead of time that you had an attraction to men.
No, I came out to her after we were married.
Okay, so let's venture down that. How did she react to that? And that in that part of your mixed orientation marriage, was that a good idea or bad idea to withhold that information from her?
I think it was a bad idea, because she had no choice. I mean, had I told her beforehand, she could have made a choice that would have been hers. And because I withheld it from her, I made the choice for her. And I don't think that was correct of me to do. But I came out to her after we had already been married for 6 years. We had 3 kids already. And I was struggling with my sexuality more so anyway, because our marriage was turbulent, and the more difficult our marriage became, the more my curiosity around men was piqued. And I stumbled across a gay porn magazine and looked at it, and was instantly filled with all sorts of guilt, and I couldn't handle the guilt, and so I confessed what I had done to her, and through telling her what I had did, that was my opportunity to come out to her. And so I told her, I looked at this magazine because that's how I feel inside. I'm attracted to men. And she wanted to leave me, and our church leaders told her not to. Told her to stay with me, because at the time I felt like it was something bad that I had done, and that I just needed help to overcome this, because whatever I was doing on my own wasn't working, and I was acknowledging that to her and to my religious leaders, that it's there and it's not going away, and that was where I was at.
Interesting that now you bring in 2 more people into this. She's into the circle, but then she brings in the church as well.
Yeah.
So how was it handled? Did they interview you personally? How did the church tackle that topic with you on an individual basis?
I had several interviews with what would be the equivalent of apostles. So they instantly took it up really high level. It went straight from my bishop to the apostle level in the AUB. And even with our general authority, the leader of the AUB, I had to meet with all of them, talked to them about what was going on. And at the time, my desire to overcome it was genuine. Like I wasn't being fake about, help me get over this. I was really asking them for that help, because I was fearful for my eternal welfare. And that was always the direction that I was coming at my sexuality from. I knew that it was there, and I knew that it was a part of me, but as our marriage became strained, I wasn't happy in the marriage, and so I started thinking, well, maybe I'll be happy living as a gay man. But then I was like, no, I can't do that, because then I'll be damned. And so there was this internal conflict where I'm not happy here, but I want this, but I know that's not going to make me happy either, because that's what we're always told, that wickedness never was happiness, right?
You got it.
And so there was that struggle, and I was confessing to them, I need help, because I can't overcome this on my own. So they sent me to the church, and they sent me to LDS Family Services. Well, they told me that LDS Family Services existed, and that I needed to go to my local bishop and ask for help. And so I did. I went to, I lived kind of a block away, kitty corner, from an LDS church, and I had moved back to Utah at the time. And I went to the ward house and asked if I could speak with the bishop, and they set up an appointment for me, and I told him everything that had happened. And so he arranged for me to have vouchers to go to LDS Family Services. And I went to 2 sessions and then stopped going.
What was your impression of the LDS Family Services approach to this topic?
It wasn't helpful. First of all, I only went to 2 sessions because my counselor, when I would speak to him, the look on his face was one of utter disgust, and he was very transparent with what he was feeling when I would talk to him. It was not a look of compassion. It was not a look of anything that resembled lovingness or caring. It was quite the opposite. He was very disgusted by what I was telling him, and I just felt like I didn't need his judgment, because I was hard enough on myself as it was, and felt like the sessions weren't going anywhere that was helpful for me. And his advice was, he told me about imagining that my thoughts were characters on a stage, a play on the stage, and that the good thoughts are coming in from this side of the stage and the bad thoughts are coming in from this side of the stage. And you have to imagine that when this side of the stage is starting to take over the stage, or the characters on this side of the stage are starting to take over the main scene in the play, you have to get these ones to come on and push them out. And it was a philosophy that wasn't resonating with me, even though I had been an actor all of my life. It just wasn't.
I mean, literally, you acted straight.
Well, yeah, and literally and figuratively, right? Metaphorically. But his method wasn't helpful to me, but it wasn't the method that drove me away. It was the look on his face as I was talking to him. I was just like, I don't need his judgment, because I really felt like I was hard enough on myself.
So you go back into the AUB as a failure, as a dropout, we started this podcast saying that those who are Mormon, who are LDS, were living that lower law. They just couldn't live up to our higher law. And now you've left LDS Family Services. You're still having these attractions to men that you haven't been able to reconcile. Their methodology would have you completely ridded of it, void of any of these attractions. But there you are. Mm-hmm. How do you move forward, or how did you move forward?
It all just became a blur. I think I just numbed myself to everything, quite honestly. There was actually, I want to backtrack just a little bit, because when I came out to my church leaders, there was actually a sermon preached over the pulpit that was basically about me. Because one of the apostles got up on the pulpit and talked about how he took it as a sign that because the homosexuals were among their midst, that they were not living according to the law of God. And he took it as a chastisement, that he then chastised the entire congregation, that because he didn't call it the gays, but he was basically saying the gays are among us now, and that's because we're not living righteously, and we need to buck up and live more righteously. But the whole sermon was geared toward me. And I was sitting in the congregation and felt very ashamed, frankly, that I had brought upon shame on the congregation. And I think that really messed with me psychologically, to feel the weight of the congregation on my shoulders, that I was the source of God's disapproval of them. And I was believing of that at the time. I was still wanting to do what was right. And what happened was, actually, I didn't numb myself to it. It was a very real struggle for me. And I was constantly conflicted, and my marriage really began to deteriorate strongly after that. And the more our marriage was deteriorating, the more I felt like I probably would be happier with a man. And the first thing that happened to me was my sister came to me, and she's an intuitive, and she was actually the first member of our family to leave the church, both fundamentalism and Mormonism altogether. Her marriage ended, and when her marriage ended, she left all factions of Mormonism. And she became a spiritualist and an intuitive, and had friends that were in that realm and of spirituality. And she had a friend describe me to her. And she says, "Do you have a brother that looks like this, and his personality is like this?" And she acknowledged that she did. And she said, "Your brother needs your help, and you need to go to him." And so she called me and asked me. She's like, "My friend told me about this and said that you're struggling with something that is really deep, and that you need my help." And so she was my second sibling that I came out to her. And I asked her, I was like, "Are you sitting down?" And she was like, "No, but I will." And I came out to her and told her how horrible my marriage was, and told her how the worse my marriage is, the more that my marriage is falling apart, the more I want to be gay. I just want to be with a man. And but I told her, I also expressed to her what I had just told you a moment ago, that I still felt like it was bad and didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. And she started sending me books, and I started reading these books, and a lot of the books were philosophical, and I felt like I didn't read half of them because I felt guilty reading things that were non-Mormon. Like, that's how entrenched in my religion I was, that I didn't even want to read things that weren't written by Mormons.
I think that's many people are listening to this, shaking their heads, saying familiar territory.
Yeah. And the one that actually I did read from cover to cover was Goodbye, I Love You.
Carolyn Pearson.
Carolyn Pearson, yeah. And when I finished the book, I called her and I was like, the book made me cry, but I don't want to be like him. And for a few years, that was my take on my sexuality, that I know that this is a part of me, and I know that my marriage is failing, and because it's failing, I want to be gay, but I know that I shouldn't be. And I was very, very conflicted at the time.
For those who understand this topic, I came from a mixed orientation marriage as well, and that coming out midstream, in the middle of the marriage or at some point after the honeymoon, there becomes a new honeymoon period. Okay, she now knows. I can now move forward. Things can try to work. Was that a similar situation that happened in your marriage? Did you feel like there was new breath that was breathed into your marriage that you could make this work?
Only immediately afterward, which is why we had the 2 kids, and they were had in very close succession. So we ended up having 2 more kids after I came out to her, and it was when those children were born that I felt that respite. So it was probably about a 2-year respite that I felt, or a second honeymoon of sorts, where I thought that she was very aware of my sexuality, but I think she smothered it more than I did in her own mind.
How so?
Well, because when I have to get into polygamist culture to explain that, if that's okay.
I think the viewers and listeners are saying, like, get to the polygamy.
Okay. So within polygamist culture, there is a very similar social pressure that exists in the church. When someone is in their mid to late 20s and hasn't married yet, people often will ask them, when are you getting married? That same social pressure exists in polygamous communities when a monogamous couple has been married more than 10 years and has not entered the principle, and that's what they call it. And they will ask them, when are you going to enter the principle, or when are you going to take another wife? And my former father-in-law was putting a lot of pressure on my ex-wife to give me another wife. And she felt that pressure and started very frequently suggesting different girls in our congregation to me. And, what do you think about that one? And what do you think about this one? And initially I just kind of blew it off lightly, and I would be like, oh no, or whatever. Or I would joke with her about what it would be like to be married to that one, and treated it a little lightly. But after a while, it grew old very fast for me, and I got mad at her one time, and I said, why do you suggest women to me when you know about me? And she was shocked, and she's like, what does that mean? And I told her, I said, I don't want another woman, I want a man. And I said, why don't you take another husband and we'll share him?
I'm not looking for a sister wife, I want a brother
husband, yeah. And she thought that was gross. She was actually really disgusted by the thought of sharing a man, but that was where I was. I was like, I don't want another woman. Like the thought of that is repulsive to me. I really want a man. And I think that was the moment where reality really sunk in for her, because we had been married about 10 years, and we had been married around 10 years when she told me that the only reason she stayed with me was for the kids. And that was one of the most heartbreaking things that I had ever heard. And that was when things changed for me.
Why was it the catalyst? What about that conversation or that realization helped you to move forward?
Mm-hmm, it did, because I started laying a plan at that point. But the first thing that I realized was, if we're only staying together for the children, then why do we keep having more? And these were all just internal thoughts that I had. Like she and I did not have healthy communication between the two of us. We didn't have good communication at all. And so a lot of times when I had thoughts, I would never share them with her. They were just all internal dialogue that I would have with myself. And that was one thing that it was a rude awakening for me, that if that's the only reason she's with me, then we shouldn't have any more. And in polygamous community, to have any sort of child prevention is verboten. And so child pregnancy prevention. And so
birth control.
I started watching her cycle like a hawk. And the irony is that she and I were also still very sexual all the way up until the last year of our marriage. The last year we weren't sexual at all, but up until then we were. And so I still had another 3 years where we were sexually active with each other, but I would watch the calendar and I'd be like, if she was trying to make an advance when I knew she could get pregnant, I would reject her advances.
You were tired and sick.
Yeah, I've got a headache.
Oh, how the roles were reversed.
So that was the first thing that was where the reality set in for me. And then I did lay a plan after that. I was very active in our community. I taught at the private school. I was a high school teacher. I was in the choir. I was in the Quorum of 70, which in the AUB doesn't have the same clout as it does in the church. It's not on the same level of you're a general authority if you're a 70, but there is a certain level of clout that comes with that. And I was very religious. I would go to church every day, or every Sunday, and every Wednesday I would go to priesthood meeting. And so I started laying a plan to become inactive, because I thought if I just cut it all off at once, there's going to be a huge ripple effect, and my family will probably suffer because of that. And so I laid a plan to gradually become inactive. And I started just cutting out things little by little. The very first thing I did was I withdrew from being a teacher. I was just like, I can't teach anymore. And stopped teaching at the high school. And then I started working Sundays and picking up overtime on Sundays so that I didn't have to go to church all the time. And it was a plan that took me a couple of years to bring to fruition, so that by the time I did end up leaving, I had already been inactive for a couple of years. And the ripples were still there, by the way. Like my desire to eliminate ripples I may have lessened the ripple effect, but they were still there, and my family still suffered because of it. My children by this point were entering into their teens. My oldest was 13 and my second oldest was 12 when I came out. And I actually didn't come out, I was outed. I was outed by her. And so,
do tell.
Yeah, do tell. We had been married 14 years at that point when she suggested that we separate. And I took her up on it. And I don't think she was expecting me to say yes. Because we were both lying in bed in the dark, and she shot up, turns on the lamp, and she's like, "Why?" And I was like, "Well, you know why." I was like, the more distant we become, the stronger my attraction to men becomes, to where now that's all I think about is I want to be with a man. And that was all she heard. And so from that point on, everyone that she told that we were separating, it was because I was gay, there's truth in that. I mean, it's not untrue at all, but part of the story also was that we weren't getting along, and she didn't acknowledge that part of the story.
And the larger global part of that story is that it was your story to tell, not hers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was your coming out.
Yeah. I was very resentful of the fact that she told everyone rather than me telling them. But there was also an easiness about my being outed, that other people who have to come out to different individuals one at a time, I didn't have to go through that. And so I also acknowledge that my coming out was easy because all of a sudden everyone knew. And I didn't have to have those conversations.
And I'm sure word spread through the AUB.
Like wildfire.
Quickly.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Typically, and we see this in Mormonism, these levels of ostracism. Did you feel like the community ostracized you, embraced you? How did they handle the news?
No, by and large, they were not embracing. Immediate ostracism took place. I still remained very active in parenting my children. And so I would show up on Saturdays to their baseball games, and they have Little League Baseball organized among themselves. And so they all get together in their park that's next to the church on Saturday, and the kids play baseball all day. And you start from 9 in the morning all the way until like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And they've got 4 little diamonds on the thing. And so there's 4 games going on every hour. And I did that all the way up until the year before, because they stopped playing when they're 16. When my youngest was 16 was the last year I went to baseball games. And at the beginning when I went, all of the people that used to be my friends were suddenly no longer my friends. And I was met with 2 reactions from them. Either they would totally ignore me and just pretend like they never saw me there, and so it was easy for them just not to say hi. Or they would just outright give me stink eye and give me the dirtiest looks. And these were people that I used to be friends with. These were people that I would sing in the choir with, and people that we would have over for dinner, and people that we were very, very close to and that I thought were my friends suddenly were not my friends. And the true irony was that the outcasts, the people that weren't in the in group among the polygamous community, the people that are ostracized and more on the fringes of the community, they were the ones that remained my friends.
The marginalized found the marginalized.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've never been one to ostracize marginalized people, ever. In fact, all through high school, all through whatever, people always told my sisters, oh, you're Bernie's sister, he's so nice. And so like I've always had that accepting of me, of people who are marginalized. And so it wasn't unusual for me to say hi to them either. But I found that they were the only ones that remained my friends. And it's interesting that the salt of the earth, so to speak, right, were the ones that were still Christian enough to ignore my sexuality as something bad and just recognize me as he's my friend, and I'm going to walk up and shake his hand and say hi.
It's a lesson for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So there comes a point where you have to divorce, or you did.
We did.
Let's walk down that. Probably painful.
Yeah, it was. For the first year and a half after our separation, there was nothing legal between us other than our marriage. We remained married. But in my mind, I never thought that I would marry a man. And so I just thought it would just be easier to keep her on my benefits. And I kept paying for the bills and kept providing for her and the family. And I thought that would probably be the easier way to just maintain and sustain. And I was working 2 full-time jobs at the time. And I was leading up to our divorce or separation as well. So that wasn't new for me to work 2 jobs. But after a year and a half, I was served with papers at work, with divorce papers. And it took a long time for the divorce to transact. It was very expensive and very contentious on both of our parts. I'm not going to play the victim because I wasn't. I I was fighting for rights just as much as she was. And I think each of us had a fear that the other one would take the children away from us and that we wouldn't have a relationship with the children anymore. And I think it was on both sides. But because of that, I wasn't willing to just lie down and take the minimum. And so I fought, and I fought hard. It was a long and expensive fight. She was able to get counselors up on the witness stand that said that my children were afraid of me, and which was a partial truth. They were afraid to speak their mind, but not afraid of me. And but she got up there and said they're afraid of their dad, and I was really worried that a lot. And I even had neighbors that I thought were my friends. Like, these were people that we had lived next to each other for 8 years, and people that had told me how much they admired me as a father were now all of a sudden getting on the stand and saying he doesn't deserve to be with these kids. And at the time, because of my 2 full-time work schedule, I was only seeing the children. I would pick them all up on Monday nights for dinner, and we would go out and have dinner together, and then I would take them back and drop them off at her house, because all I had was a room at the time, and I really didn't have a place for them to stay. And then on Tuesdays, I would pick one of them up and go out and have one-on-one time with one of my kids. And so I was seeing the kids weekly, once a week. And her argument and her legal representation, their argument was that I deserved no more time than what I was getting, which isn't even minimum parent time in Utah. And my argument was, I'm not a bad father. I'm actually a pretty good father, and so I deserve a third of the time. I wasn't asking for half time because I knew that my work schedule wouldn't afford me the time to be with them half the time. So I was asking for a third of the time. And it took 3.5 years for the divorce to finalize. And by the time the judge issued his decree, he was able to see through all of the smoke. And I actually have a judge who in Utah was viewed as liberal, which I'm very thankful for, because he saw through all of the smoke. My sexuality for him wasn't an issue. He just wanted to know whether I was a good parent.
As it should have been.
Yeah. And but their take on it all was his sexuality is so abhorrent to these children that he shouldn't be with them because they can't handle it.
You say their take. Who was involved in her divorce?
Everyone. So the AUB funded her divorce. And she, at one time, when the divorce was in its early stages, she told me that the leader of the AUB told her that she needed to protect the children from me because of my sexuality, that if she allowed them to be around me, then I would contaminate them and they would be lost. And so the AUB funded, and as far as I know, there was unlimited funds, just because a lot of the time when new legal action was taking place, it was always driven by her side. And I have a lawyer who luckily was willing to let me accrue debt with him, and I'm still paying him off to this day. Like 10 years after the divorce was finalized, I'm still just making him little small payments, probably the equivalent of a car payment, and I've been paying off a very expensive car for a while.
Hopefully you enjoy driving it around.
Yeah. And I found out that her church was funding it through my lawyer. Her lawyer had confessed to my lawyer that he's like, I have never seen a church write checks funding a divorce before. And that was how I found out. And she tried to make the issue about my gayness, so then I tried to make it about her affiliation with a polygamist group. And so what she did was she tried to hide that by, she started attending her local ward in the church, the mainstream church, and started having the Relief Society sisters from the church visit her and the family. And
sad.
Yeah.
A lot of wasted time.
Mm-hmm.
Because of indoctrination.
Yeah.
Or this inability to see that diversity exists
Yeah.
in and out of the church.
Yeah. Oh, and I even had a brother. Oh, can I tell this story? I didn't tell you before the podcast, but I think it may resonate with your listeners. I had a brother who, my blood brother, not a brother in the church, but one of my brothers told my middle child when he was first entering into his teenage years that he needed to be careful around me. And so my son comes to me and is telling me this, and he was like, I just don't know whether you're going to like make an advance on me or something. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh. So first of all, I had this conversation with my child about I'm like, most parents have no sexual attraction toward their offspring. I'm like, are you afraid of your mom because she's straight? I'm like, are you afraid that she's going to make an advance on you? And he's like, no. And I'm like, well, it's the same thing with me. I'm like, even though I'm your dad and I'm attracted to men, that doesn't mean that I'm suddenly now attracted to my male offspring. I'm like, I have no sexual desire toward my children, and most parents don't. I'm like, there's that random fluke parent out there that does, but that's a very small minority. I'm like, most parents just biologically have zero sexual attraction to their children. I'm like, it doesn't matter whether you're gay or straight, that sexual attraction doesn't exist between parent and children. It's there biologically. And I was like, if I touch your knee or touch your shoulder, I'm like, you know the difference between good touch, bad touch. You were taught that in elementary school. And I'm like, you know that if my touches are a father demonstrating affection towards his child versus me making a sexual advance on you. And I'm like, you have nothing to be worried about when you're here with me. I'm like, that's not going to happen. And then I called up my brother and chewed him out. But that's the kind of mentality that exists, I think, in both cultures, the church and fundamentalism, is they think that somehow because you're sexually attracted to the same sex, that means you're also a pedophile, and that you're attracted to boys. And I had to tell my brother that. I'm like, being gay doesn't make me a pedophile. I'm like, and how dare you say that to my child? You know, it's just, and I'm sure that there are some of your listeners out there that have experienced very similar things.
I experienced it myself. Having come out, then leaving the church, and leaving the church as the young men's president. Mm-hmm. All of those things, the very same thing. Parents, whoa, did he? Yeah. Was he? And I had the very same argument. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It just didn't work that way.
I'm attracted to men, not to boys.
That's exactly right. Yikes. So what is life like on this side of the aisle? You've had quite a story, quite an adventure, years of experience battling for the right to be authentic and honest about who and what you are. You're now, your children are all adults. Mm-hmm. What does life look like now?
It's a breath of fresh air compared to what it used to be. I have to be very honest about that. I went through several years of stress. My grays can attest to that. Very, very stressful. I felt like I walked on eggshells around my kids when they were younger, because I wanted them to know that even though I was gay and was out to them, that I was still their dad. And I just didn't quite know how to give them that reassurance. And I just found out over time that just being myself with them and establishing routine with them. I think the biggest thing, and it was actually advice that was given to me by my same sister that gave me reading material. She learned that Sidney Poitier had gone through a bitter divorce as well. And that his advice to fathers who have gone through a divorce, and I know that you probably have LGBT viewers who are not just men, but any parent should remain constant in their relationship with their children. And over time, Sidney learned that the consistency he exhibited with his daughters won them over. Like they were bitter towards Sidney Poitier at the beginning, and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. And he decided very early on after his divorce that he was going to be consistent with his daughters. And over time, that consistency paid off. And I took that same advice and decided that I needed to be the same consistent parent toward my children that I was when I was home with their mother. And so that involved discipline, that involved, making sure they did their homework, that involved routine, everything that you can think about parenting when the two parents are living together and now you're parenting separately in separate households. The only thing that I differed from was I told my kids, I'm like, there are some rules that you will have at your mom's house that you will not have at my house. That doesn't mean then that because the rule at my house is okay and you can do this at my house, but then when you go to your mom's house, she has a different rule. You can't go there and say, well, I can do it at dad's, so I can do it at yours. Because we never learned to parent together. That's the failure of my marriage. And it was consistent even when we were married. We had very opposing views on parenting throughout our entire marriage. And that was just accentuated even more once we were living in separate households. But being able to remain consistent with my children, I think, is what has allowed our relationships to grow and develop and evolve. My younger children claim that they were unaffected by my sexuality. They were more affected by the divorce. But my two older children, I think, just had enough wherewithal. And I also made the mistake of coming out to them and telling them we were separating in the same conversation. And that I know wholeheartedly was a mistake. And if I would have been working with a counselor at the time, a counselor would have told me, don't have those two conversations at the same time, but I did. And so my two older children, the two were intertwined and they couldn't separate them. And so my two older children, we had a very strained relationship for years. My oldest son confided to me when he was a late teen. He told me, he was like, I hated you for 2 years.
That's tough, isn't it?
Yeah. And my older daughter was the same way. For years, she couldn't tell me that she loved me, because I would still talk to them every day on the phone. And that's part of the consistency. I wanted them to know that I was in their life every day, even though they weren't spending every day with me. And so I would call them every day after school and find out how school went. And even if their responses were fine, you know how teens and young kids just give one-word answers, What do you have going on? Nothing, and how was school? Fine. And you have to coax the answers out of them.
I have an 11-year-old in that same boat right now.
Yeah,
I get it.
Yeah, and it's, parenting teens is the same. It's whether you're together or not, it's the same. And I found that consistency ultimately won my kids over. And I have a very good relationship with all of them right now. I had a relationship where I was living with my partner for over 3 years, and they all knew him, they liked him, got along with him. They all had a certain level of relationship with him, and were sad when he and I separated. And that was very eye-opening to me. And I think the most eye-opening experience was when my first child turned 18. That was actually when my ex-wife and I both relaxed around each other, because at that point he was an adult, could make his own decisions. And I think we were both waiting with bated breath to find out which side they would pick. And I really think that was the dynamic that was going on within us, like who was going to win the kids. And when the kids chose to have relationships with both of us, we were like, oh, it's okay.
That's how it works.
Yeah, that's how it works, and it's okay. And then we both relaxed. And so with our parenting with the younger children, it has actually been a lot more, there's a lot fewer arguments and tension that have taken place. There's still a certain amount of tension that's there because she and I disagree on so many things fundamentally. I wished we could have had something amicable, and I wish we could have something amicable now, but I have to acknowledge that likely won't ever exist between us. As far as being gay and out, I've stubbed my toe just like every other gay man or gay woman has when they come out. We fall for that person that we should have never really fallen for. I've gone through my horror phase just like I think most people do. I've tried being with the in crowd. I've tried being out of the in crowd. I've tried, I think all of us try to find our tribe. I think that's the search that we all
That's
search
fair.
for,
Yep.
you know? And so you try associating with different people. And at this point in my life, not just being gay, but like I'm late 40s, almost 50, and I'm just at a point in life where I just don't have time for superficial games. And so I choose not to be friends and hang out with people who are superficial. You know, I was very fit at one point, you know, and could turn heads when I would walk into the club. And then when I gained weight and lost my fitness, and guys would give you that up and down stare and turn their head up like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. And I was like, that's just so elementary, you know, like why does that even matter? Why does the type of body I have matter?
So celestial kingdom.
Yeah. Right?
Huh.
And you know, I've done it all. I've never gone to circuit parties and things like that. So I haven't done it all, but I've done enough for me to realize that I'm just me, and that's all I need to be. And I think that something that was important for me to own is that my journey is mine, and it doesn't belong to anybody else. And so whatever experiences I have are unique to me, even though we all have similar experiences, you know, and my story is mine, and I can own that and be comfortable with the fact that, you know, I don't like going to clubs, so why should I go? You know, just because everybody else chooses to go on a Saturday night doesn't mean I have to.
Amen to that.
You know?
I danced like a white guy with rent due, so the club never did it for me.
Yeah.
The last part of this podcast, as we wrap up, anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to talk about? Any nuggets of pieces of advice you want to give to our listeners?
Yeah, I think kind of along the same vein of every journey is unique and individual. I think part of my experience in having different friends is that I've also been friends with people who are just starting their journey and just really starting to explore who they are. And they can also be at different ages, which I think is also interesting that we need to acknowledge that, you know, some people's journey starts when they're 16, 15, you know. I've known guys that have come out that young, and kudos to them for having the wherewithal to acknowledge who they are to themselves and to other people around them. And then there are other people who I think would fall into a similar vein as I did, where it just was so frightening to even own up to that when you were so ingrained with your eternal welfare being at stake. That for others it takes a lot longer, and I've, like, when I decided that I was going to leave, like, that was my decision, and I laid out my plan and I went forward with it and never really looked back. Well, that's not even true either. I did look back once, but I've seen guys that like will come out of the church, and when I'm saying the church, I mean the LDS Church. They'll come out of the church and they'll dabble in with gay friends and try to associate and assimilate in gay culture, and then guilt will overcome them and they'll go back to the church. And they'll some of them will go through the repentance process and everything, and then they come back out again. And I've seen some guys do that multiple times. And I've seen other guys in the gay community that judge them so harshly for that and actually get really angry. And they'll be like, why don't they just come out? Why don't they just own up to it? And I've tried to be the voice of reason with those guys and be like, you know, they don't have that same wherewithal that you had at that age, or they're struggling with a little bit more of a religious side of it than you might have.
Or their journey is their journey.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's just as individual. Everyone has their own story and their own journey to pursue. And I think that we should be a little more tolerant of those people that don't follow the same journey we followed. You know, and some people come out when they're in their teens. Some people come out in their 50s, and it's just as individual as we are. And I think that's the last thing I would leave your listeners with.
I think it's great advice. I've always believed that the coming out experience isn't meant for society. It isn't about coming out to tell everybody who and what we are. It's an opportunity to let people in on our terms. It's our invitation to let people into our lives and to give them the opportunity to get to know us better. And there will be natural rejection. You've explained that throughout this podcast episode, how some people left. A lot of people walked out of your life. People who you thought were friends were no longer friends. People you thought who were acquaintances weren't there. But that's the beauty of coming out, is that you gave them the invitation. You invited them into your life. And they chose not to accept that. So no longer do I need to beat myself up for the actions of other people when I gave them that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think the listeners will understand exactly what you're saying when framed that way, that this is your opportunity to be you and invite people in to see that part of you.
Yeah, well said.
Thanks. Bernie, it's been great. I appreciate you giving us some of your time and sharing your story, a vulnerable story, but it's so interesting, so fascinating. The religious side of it, the familiar side to so many who will listen to this podcast episode who say, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember those feelings. I'm going through those now. And those who are still on the other side of the closet wall who long to come out.
Yeah.
I think your advice and your story is evidence that there is life after the closet door.
There is.
And that there are still moments of happiness and excitement and the opportunity to still find progression.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
No, thank you.
The Latter-day Stories podcast, your opportunity to better understand this intersection of sexuality and reality, where it meets at LDS Street and LGBTQ Avenue. Again, if you found something in this podcast episode that resonated with you, a nugget of truth or something that you wanted to comment about, please, if you're on the video version, take that opportunity to share that below. And maybe even just let us know what you thought. Was there something that did resonate? Was there something in your journey, your individual story, that was similar to that of Bernie's? I'd love to hear that. If you are following on our audio version, we invite you to subscribe to this channel wherever you're catching your favorite audio podcasts. We are on iHeartMedia, Google, through the Google Play app, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere you find your favorite podcasts. Again, thank you for spending the hour with us and getting to better understand Bernie's story and the story that is so familiar to many within the LGBTQ community. Our purpose, again, is to try to help build bigger and stronger bridges between these two communities, but most importantly, give us an opportunity to share our stories and navigate this journey together. It's stories just like Bernie's and yours and mine and ours together that help us to continue writing our latter-day stories.